So the talk is titled 21st Century Photography and Post-Representation. But before we start, I want to acknowledge the people of the Wurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands we conduct our business. I want to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So what is this thing that we call 21st century photography? The first point I want to make is that the 21st century roughly marks a fundamental shift in how we produce and encounter photographs. I'm calling it 21st century photography. You might also, if you're doing searches, get results for terms like digital photography, computational photography, algorithmic photography, ubiquitous photography, expanded photography, post photography, and imaging futures. So all of those terms, we're kind of in the process of trying to find a way to label or categorize this development. I'm going to start with an exhibition that I curated with Shane Hulbert, Rebecca Najowski, and Daniel Palmer, called The Image Looks Back. And I'm going to start this talk with the central proposition that we concluded our catalogue essay with. The technical medium of photography is fundamentally implicated in giving shape to the cultural paradigms through which we see ourselves. And I want to talk about the difference between these two images. On one hand, we've got the 1969 image of the Earth from space, and on the other side, we've got 50 years later, the 2019 image of a black hole. And the contrast I want to make is the Earthrise image, which is a film-based image, it's an optical image. I want to position that as an example of Heidegger's concept of the world as an image. Very few of us have actually stood on the moon's surface and seen this view of the Earth from space. But because we've seen this image, we hold this image in our mind's eye. So it's a great example of Heidegger's idea of knowing the world through images. I'm going to contrast that with the photograph of the black hole. And what's interesting about this photograph of the black hole is that it's actually been created using information gathered from telescopes all over the surface of the Earth. And it's a generative image that's been built up from data collected from various sites across the surface of the planet. So whilst the 1969 image embodies the world as an image, the process of creating the 2019 black hole image reconfigures the Earth as an image sensor, with each of the telescopes that contribute the data of the black hole acting like the light-sensitive elements of a digital image sensor. We no longer simply know the world as an image. In an ontological sense, we're wrapped inside the architecture of the generative image, situated on the surface of the site at which the image is formed. We are literally in camera. We're living enmeshed within the ubiquitive forces that propel the flow of images from the point of formation and encounter. And perhaps in this metaphorical reconfiguring, we can glimpse the paradigm shift wrought by the expansion of photography into ubiquitous networked computing. The world is a sensor, not simply an image. Examples of artists and photographers who are working in this kind of space include Rosa Menkman, whose work really interrogates the architecture of the image. This body of work called Beyond Resolution, where she's looking at the conceptual and cultural implications of the file formats that we use is particularly significant. And I also want to point to the Post-Photography Prototyping Prize, which is presented at the Photographers Gallery in London in collaboration with the Photo Museum in Amsterdam. One of the works I love from that is this work by a group that worked on generative photography. The group is Adam Brown, Tabia Islay, and Alan Warburton. So this is a kind of like a hackathon where they were asked to produce a body of work within, I think it was 24 hours. And they created this work that was a little bit of a proposition where the audience couldn't actually see the work unless they covered their face. So it was using the metaphor of a wildlife photographer where you have to make yourself invisible in order to see the subject. The scenario they set up, they had a camera that was looking for an image of your face, and if it saw your face, the subject of the image would disappear. So it's this kind of literally the image looking back at you and trying to avoid being seen. So I've stated that something fundamental has shifted in the 21st century. There's this incredible hyperabundance of images that have emerged. I first started tracking the proliferation of images online back in 2012, and then we thought it was incredible the number of images that were being shared through the internet. But the latest data I had was back in 2014, where Mary Meeker estimated that there were 1.8 billion photographs being uploaded and shared every single day. So we can see from this graph how the sharing of images has become exponentially larger and more prolific. There's this incredible image here from the Today Show that compared two photographs of St. Peter's Square at the announcement of the popes. And you can see in the first image that there are hardly any smartphones or screens being shown, whereas several years later you can see that everyone is holding up a screen to record the event. So that I usually mark the break point at the beginning of this particular development in the ecology of photography as the launch of the iPhone. And it's that point at which we have the convergence of capture, distribution, and viewing all in one device. So you can take a photograph and distribute it and view a photograph with one device in a couple of seconds. So as I said, there's been a fundamental shift in how we produce and encounter photographs. The affordances of the medium, which is what it's possible to do with a thing, has expanded. We've gone from analog photography to digital photography to ubiquitous photography. And the ecology of image photography has fundamentally changed. We now have the porous boundary between still and moving images to also point to the shifts in the economy of the image. So rather than, I'll just jump forward to this example. So this is a story from 2019 about a photographer who found herself dropped from a campaign because she didn't have enough Instagram followers. And she was told by Canon that you have to have at least 50,000 Instagram followers in order to be contracted with them to do a campaign with them. The other example I've got here is The Humans of New York was commissioned by the United Nations back in 2014 to travel to places like Afghanistan to do their street photography. And the other example we have is the Sartorialist, sponsored by the Australian Tourism Commission to attend Melbourne Fashion Week. Now, What's interesting about each of these examples is that they're not actually being, the commissioner is not purchasing their photographs, they're purchasing their audience. So the example of the Humans of New York, last time I looked, they had about 18 million followers on Facebook. So it's about the commissioner is interested in the audience, not just the images that the photographer is making. The other point I want to make about this phenomenon of 21st century photography is the way that photography has become diffused into ubiquitous computing. The one example is the emergence of facial recognition software. So in this example, this is a story, a journal article published again back in 2014 that estimated that Facebook's algorithm, known as DeepFace, has a 97% accuracy, which is very similar to that of human recognition of faces in photographs. Another example is this interesting work by Zach Blass called Face Cage, and he states here the computational biometric diagram, a supposedly perfect measuring and accounting of the face, once materialized as a physical object, transforms into a cage that does not easily fit the human head. That is extremely painful to wear. These cages exaggerate and perform the irreconcilability of the biometric diagram with the materiality of the human face itself and the violence that occurs when the two forces coincide. As Trevor Paglen has wrote in 2016, the overwhelmingly majority of images is now made by machines for other machines, with sometimes humans rarely in the loop. Talking about machine vision and artificial intelligence, I love this example from 2012 when Google Research set an artificial intelligence deep learning program the task of looking at YouTube videos in order to learn to recognize content. And the two things that it began to discern from looking at YouTube was faces, but also cats. So cats are very central to this emergent space. But back in 2013, Sam Bland made his Googleology series, and it was a strategy for reverse engineering the Google image search algorithm. And back at that time, the results did not appear to recognize content. It only recognized patterns of light and dark and color. As we move forward to 2018, if you put an image into Google Search by Images, it will actually attach a word to the image and then show you results that also match the word and the content, not just the pattern of the surface of the frame. So in 2014, Google developed automated captions, and at that time the captions weren't 100% accurate, but it was a pretty damn good start. So we've actually got these artificial intelligences starting to apply words that describe photographs. In 2016, Facebook introduced audio description of images for vision impaired users. And this is often a way that these applications are found to have a use. When Facebook first introduced automatic facial recognition and tagging, it was up for a little while and they had to actually turn it off because it freaked people out somewhat. But it's become now an established part of how these platforms explain their images. One of the reasons I use the term expanding photography is not simply the expansion of the affordances of photography from analog through to digital. I'm actually talking literally about the expansion of the photographic image, the photographic capture from a 2D plane to literally a field, a light field, a spatialized capture. We can see this in light field photography, and the light field technique uses a similar technique to the way that we understand depth through perception of having two eyes. A light field camera, or photogrammetry, which I'm about to speak about in a moment, uses the shifts in perspective between one site and another to calculate the position of an object, to understand depth. A light field camera will sometimes have a series of little lenses across the site, that these are micro lenses that give us an insight into that is able to calculate the position of different objects and create a 3D render of the space. Photogrammetry uses not micro lenses, but a series of cameras or captures around the subject that then is able to build a 3D model. This is a series of screenshots from a project that shows us the original capture of the subject using a rig of cameras that all go off simultaneously. It's like a speeded up version of bullet time in a way. We then get a render of point clouds that then builds a mesh, and the texture, the photographic texture, is then wrapped around the 3D model. And we start to see the inclusion of 3D printing into photographic discourse. This is not a new phenomenon. Bernini sometimes worked from what were known as triple portraits. When the subject couldn't travel to the sculpture, they would commission a triple portrait, and a sculpture was then rendered from those different views. One of my favourite examples is what we could think of as a form of steampunk photogrammetry that was developed by Francois Roulean in Paris in the 1860s. His studio that he built had 24 cameras that all went off simultaneously, and from the captures he then projected those onto a screen that he then translated into a sculptural outcome. It's now possible to make almost in-time 3D scans using adapters that go onto iPads. Some of the new iPhones have a LiDAR scanner embedded in the device itself. So there are some theorists who are attempting to make sense of this changing ecology, and I want to run through just a couple of them with you. The first I'm going to mention is Jeffrey Bachman, who, in his epitaph to Burning with Desire, he observed that photography has experienced several fundamental reconfigurations without a break in the continuity of the practice. Essentially, he's proposing that photography is a desire that is not necessarily tied to the technology. He makes the point that he compares this to the way that every time there's a new imaging setup that comes into play, the first thing we do is to take a photograph of our children. So, at first glance, the development of the charged couple device in 1969 would appear to be the breakpoint between analog and digital photography. The impact of this invention was acknowledged in 2009 when Smith and Boyle won the Nobel Prize for Physics in recognition of their invention. And certainly this device is at the heart of the digital camera we use today, replacing the film behind the camera shutter. But Jeffrey Bachman argues in this chapter called Electricity Made Visible that the digital was actually embedded in the birth of photography. So this small, unassuming image of a gentleman inventor could claim to be one of the most significant images in computing. It is actually a reproducible image. It's not an etching. It's an image that has been created using a Jacquard, which uses punch cards to program the action of the lunar minutes. I've actually seen this in the British Museum I could correct myself, it's not the British Museum, it was the British Museum of Science and Technology. So it's actually quite a tiny image, and it's made using black and white silk. I'm going to play this little video just to explain how the Jacquard loom works. But I also want you to think about what we understand about digital images in terms of breaking the image up into tiny pixels. The fabric design is copied into this grid, which is very similar to the grid of pixels that we have. And then the design is translated into punch cards. Punch cards were very important in the early days of computing. My father was a computer scientist in the 70s, and one of my earliest memories is actually drawing with crayons on his discarded punch cards. So the way that the Jacquard loom worked was to using the holes of which we could equate to ones and zeros, the pixel is either turned on or off. So you can go from the black and the white that we see in the image we saw a moment ago. A really important piece of technology. And Bachman argues in the article that I've referred to a moment ago that this image was owned by Charles Babbage, who is seen to be one of the early inventors of the proto-computing. And it was this invention that gave him some ideas for his difference engine. So Charles Babbage, I've actually seen Charles's brain in a bucket in, again, the same science museum in London. He wasn't really particularly well known, but was recently rediscovered, as it were, as people started to look for the origins of computing. And as I said, he owned a copy of this silk image that is essentially a transcoded image produced by a machine. Babbage also owned work by Fox Talbot, and I want to make the point that Fox Talbot, in his early contact prints, was using machine woven lace. So there's this, not only do these people all know each other and are contemporaries that are talking to each other, but they are also working at this interface of the machine image and reproduction. Another person who was working at this time is Samuel Morse. He was as you know, the inventor of Morse code, but also a painter of some renown, and he had attempted to fix the image of the camera obscura around the same time that Daguerre and Fox Talbot were attempting to resolve this problem. So when we look at Morse code, we can see the dots and dashes and begin to think about the concept of digitalization and the thinking that led to computing and our digital images. The other example I have here is from Punch magazine, Thomas Edison's imagined telephonoscope, which looks remarkably like a version of steampunk Skype. These are all examples that are cited by Geoffrey Bachman in Electricity Made Visible, in which he's arguing that the digital and photography have always been related. This final example is from the cover of Scientific American and is the very first photograph sent by a fax machine. Faxes are sometimes seen as being different from the digital image, but it is very much an example of the image being dematerialized and rematerialized via transmission. So that's to reiterate the point. Bachman argues that digital thinking is embedded at the birth of the photography. The next theorist I want to bring your attention to is Daniel Rubinstein, who is quite different and perhaps contrary to Bachman. He's arguing that the digital era of ubiquitous photography is so different from photography in the 20th century that the theoretical frameworks that we built for ourselves in the 20th century to understand and think about photography no longer really make sense. To quote from this fantastic essay that was published by the Photographers Gallery in London back in, I think it was 2015, this was first published. He says, "The four horsemen of the photographic apocalypse, index, punctum, document, and representation, can no more account for this process than a printed page can explain the operation of the computer screen." So there's this group of theorists and academics who are seeking to look at photography afresh in the 21st century and to talk about how it is operating in ways that differ from how we understood it as a film-based medium. Another theorist that I find particularly useful thinking about 21st century photography is Donna Harvey. One consequence is that our sense of connection to our tools is heightened. For us, the imagination and in other practice, machines can be prosthetic devices, intimate components, and friendly selves. And so we can begin to think about the camera as a mental prosthesis. We are already cyborgs. Our engagement with technology extends our mental capacities. One of the examples that I sometimes give about the extent to which our experience of the world is so deeply embedded in our technological and media environment is a series of studies that were done that found that people who grew up with black and white television were more likely to recall their dreams as black and white, whereas those without exposure to black and white television are more likely to recall their dreams as having colour. So even our dreams are inflected by our exposure to our technologies. Two more theorists I want to talk about. Willem Flusser, who talks about the geometry of thought mediated by media. And to put it very simply, he articulates writing as being linear. So in the written word facilitates linear thought, where you have to put one word next to another in a line, whereas photographs are surfaces and two-dimensional, and so they facilitate scanning modes of thought, whereas computer technologies create interconnected networks that facilitate more complex thinking. This is taken from an interview with him in 1988, and in this interview he's kind of saying that he's frustrated that other people are not quite understanding the implications of digital environments and computing and how that's going to impact on how we think about the world. He uses the concept of an assemblage to describe our relationship with our technologies. So to quote Daniel Palmer in his article about cat photographers, the emergence of these cameras you can attach to your cat. In Willem Flusser's terms, the cat is not merely a functionary of the apparatus, but the whole human-machine cat assemblage, that we're not separate from our camera, we're actually part of an assemblage with our devices. And I noticed how this actually points back to my original proposition from The Image Looks Back, that we're enmeshed in the technology, that we're at the site of the image production. So the final theorist I want to point to as being useful in the 21st century photography space is Heterozygote. And I want to read to you this short quote. "A while ago I met an extremely interesting developer in Holland. He was working on smartphone camera technology. A representational mode of thinking is that there is something out there and it will be represented by means of optical technology, ideally via indexable links. But the technology of the phone camera is quite different, as the lenses are tiny and basically crap. About half the data captured by the sensors are noise. The trick is to create the algorithm to clean the picture from the noise, or rather to define the picture from within the noise. But how does the camera know this? Very simple. It scans all other pictures stored on the phone or on your social media networks and sifts through your contacts. It looks through the photographs you've already made and those that are networked to you and tries to match faces and shapes. In short, it creates the picture based on earlier pictures on your/its memory. It does not only know what you saw, but also what you might see based on your previous choices. In other words, it speculates on your preferences and offers an interpretation of data based on affinities with other data. The link to the thing in front of the lens is still there, but there are also links to past pictures that create the picture. You don't really photograph the present as the past is woven into it. Another proposition that points to this is this article by Savov from 2017, where they propose that the end game for cameras is having no camera at all, and was illustrated by this image of a mobile phone with no camera, and that essentially would sense where you are and render an image based on previous images of that location. A sort of inverse proposition of this idea is Philip Schmidt's camera restrictor, which would actually literally prevent you from taking photographs of a site that had already been photographed. The idea that a digital image is made up is actually not new. The Bayer array that gives us digital images of colour is substantially made up. So the Bayer array is a series of colour filters that fits across the centre, and so you've got a group of sensors that collect red, green and blue, and through the demosaicing process, those missing information is essentially made up to give us our full resolution red, green, blue outputs. The output is in a large aspect made up from the scattering of selected colour samples. The JPEG image is also generated from a small selection of saved pixels. And this is where compression artifacts come from. When you edit and save a JPEG several times, you get what's called compression artifacts, which are essentially the algorithm making up the pixels and not quite getting it right. So NVIDIA is doing some of the more leading work in terms of image sensors and algorithms. The example we've got here is a very noisy image of a koala that has been cleaned up by their algorithm. They're also doing a lot of work with artificial intelligence, reconstructing photographs to construct photographs of people that has a very extremely believable result. And we're now seeing AI delving into the space of image interpolation. So we have a problem in digital photography. If you want to make your photograph bigger and you don't have enough pixels, we often get results that are slightly unsatisfactory. So Gigapixel has come up with the idea of actually using an AI that looks at photographs out in the image space and using that information to fill in the gaps when we want to enlarge our photographs. Going even more further is the emergence of edges to photo bicycle GAN algorithms. So in edges to photo, in this example, the images of these products of shoes have actually been, there's no photography involved, it's simply a sketch of the product, and the AI fills in and creates a photographically believable image of the product. So look, if you Google edges to photograph, you'll find some more of the incredible work that's being done in that space. My favorite is edges to cats. So you can fit any sketch that you do will be rendered to look something like a bit of a Frankenstein cat. So to take that one step further, StackGAN from 2016 have been working on not even doing a sketch, but simply writing a text description, and from the text description, the GAN will actually create a photographic image. So we've gone from having AIs look at a photograph and write a caption to simply writing a caption, and the AI then builds us a photograph. So what next? MIT have, for several years now, have been working on a camera that can photograph around a corner. They've been looking at super fast cameras that can literally photograph the splashback of light from bouncing off something around a corner. 2017, there was a series of articles about using DNA for storing image data. But the area that I find intriguing is the area of actually seeking to image the mind's eye. I'm not saying that this is something that we should be embracing. I'm simply noting it as almost sort of in my mind, a proposition that this could be where photography is going. This is an example of some work done back in 2011 at Berkeley, where they were using an MRI machine to map brain activity and using their research to reconstruct that brain activity to construct what the person is thinking about. They've moved now from using an MRI to EEG setups. And as we pointed to before, the desire to do this is not new. Back in 1913, Tesla announced that he'd figured out how to photograph thoughts. He never actually wrote down exactly how he had figured out how to do this, like many of his inventions, but I think it's extremely significant that the desire to do this had already been articulated. So I'm going to leave you back where we started, that we've shifted from knowing the world through images to actually being bound up inside the architecture of the image itself, that we are the site of production of the image, not simply knowing the world through the image.